I am Joe Legato, and this is the Joe Legato Show. For our next segment, we'll be talking about distractions from the decline of America. And so, a reason for America's current relationship with China is because America is just trying to distract from problems America is having domestically. In upcoming segments, we'll talk about things like the personal and national debt of the United States, as well as talking about the increasing depression, anxiety, suicide, drug dependence, and drug overdose in the United States. For this video, we'll be talking primarily about Ray Dalio's articles, which you can find on LinkedIn, and Ray Dalio's book on the changing world order. And so I'm going to show you some graphics related to that. And so here we see the typical cycle of a nation state. Okay? And Ray Dalio is making the case that United States is over the hurdle of this cycle. And so United States after World War II was clearly the dominant manufacturing power. I believe it had over half of the manufacturing capacity of the entire world. There was peace, prosperity, and productive debt growth for the United States. It was trading a lot. It had a lot of goods to trade with other nations. However, a debt bubble started to form, and there was a big wealth gap. And we're seeing increasing signs of debt bust and an economic downturn. And so we're on the other side of this this normal distribution, this bell-shaped curve of data. And we're seeing that inflation is increasing. Nothing the Federal Reserve, the government, is able to do is decreasing inflation enough that it's a significant decrease. And they're having to mess with things like our ability to measure inflation, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, in order to hide a lot of the inflation that's occurring in current society. And so they're printing a lot of money, and they're having to get a lot of goods from other countries. And the only thing really propping up America at this point is the reserve status of its currency. And so we're right at the point where people in the United States are starting to consider things like revolutions and civil wars. I read a study that over half of Americans think a civil war is going to occur or violence is going to occur sometime in the future because of the increasing political tensions in the country. So here we see some of the determinants of the rise and decline of various nations. And just to emphasize, all of these determinants you can see that the United States is starting to decline in. Things like education. United States education is not what it used to be. A lot of foreigners who used to come to the United States, which was called the brain drain, all the best and brightest of other countries would come to the United States and would just stay here afterwards. Well, they're coming to some of our top institutions still, but they're going back to their country because of how dangerous it is to live in America. And also, a lot of these people who are the best and brightest in other countries are even willing to be educated in their home country or in other countries abroad, aside from America, because of the declining standards of American education. In terms of trade, America is not the manufacturing powerhouse that it used to be. In terms of innovation and technology, you're seeing even in terms of things like big tech, social tech, things like that, social media, that America is just not innovating the way it used to be. China, in terms of major technologies, is developing more technologies, getting more patents, things like that. In terms of economic output, it's all just based off of the reserve currency at this point. The United States really isn't making much, and the value of its services are declining as well. In terms of competitiveness, really the only thing that America has going for it at this point is, well, I shouldn't say the only thing, we'll get into some other things, but the primary way that America is competitive is through sanctioning other nations if other nations are more competitive, which, funnily enough, in China, they must see that as very similar to the century of humiliation because when UK couldn't win with China in terms of competitiveness for goods, the UK just started selling drugs to China and refused to stop selling drugs. And while now you see United States, and then when that didn't work, when China tried to stop the sale of drugs, UK just invaded China and caused a lot of economic harm and actual physical harm to China and Chinese people. And the United States does really the same thing. It's not competitive in terms of its manufacturing capacity or the quality of its goods anymore. And so what it does is it will intervene either militarily or economically to harass other nations. In terms of financial centers, you're seeing Asia becoming a major powerhouse in this regard. People are moving their money away from places like New York and London. We've seen that United States and various Western countries will just steal your money if they don't like you. They've done this for Venezuela. They've done this for Russia. They will freeze your money and then they will steal it if they can figure out a way to steal the money. And so, why would any nation stay? Why would any person or any nation have their money in Western financial institutions at this point? And then, in terms of military, the United States is clearly declining its military. People are not joining. Recruitment is far down. They keep having to lower standards. The quality of the military technology. The United States is falling far behind in terms of critical technologies such as hypersonic missiles. Russia and China are far ahead of the United States there. I heard, I think, about a month ago about another failed test of hypersonic missiles in the United States. And then finally, the reserve currency status is very important for an economic powerhouse. And you see here that the United States is declining in terms of being a reserve currency for nations around the world. And so all of its advantages, and really I should mention that the reserve currency status really underpins everything else. You can print more money if you are the reserve currency nation in order to prop up all these other things. And so when you lose reserve currency status, you can't just print money. You have to add value to the international economy in order to get things in return, which is how other nations have to live. But the United States has typically not lived in that fashion. They've just printed money whenever they've needed it. But that's very obviously going away soon, and it's going away very rapidly. So here we see various elements of an empire, a world order, all across the cycle of an empire. Progressions of empire is how Ray Dalio would say. You can see the link in the corner for his LinkedIn post, because all of these graphics do come from Ray Dalio's work, and I would again encourage you to buy Ray Dalio's book on the Changing World Order, which explains all of this further. And there's also a YouTube video, I believe it's about 50 minutes long, has millions of people have watched it, has millions of views on the Changing World Order, which will explain all of this in a lot more detail. But we can see here that whether you're pro or anti-American, that America is clearly on the decline here. It's less productive, so its manufacturing capacity is a tiny fraction of what it used to be. It's overextended, it's all across the world, it's losing competitiveness, it has to focus on military and economic interventions to win, and the wealth gap is really absurd in America right now. It's horrific how poor some people are and how obscenely wealthy the people in power are. Large debts. Americans, both on an individual level and a national level, have a ton of debt. We're going to talk about that in another segment. Printing money is, I believe I remember reading within the last few years, like 80% of the money in circulation has been printed within the last few years, last like 3 or 4 years. So it's obscene how much money is being printed in order to prop up America still. Internal conflict is getting worse and worse. People are very hostile to each other. I've seen sitting members of Congress talk about a national divorce as splitting the country up, which is shocking. And then the loss of the reserve status, which you've seen rapidly increasing, particularly over the last year, and with nations like Saudi Arabia refusing to back up the petrodollar anymore and enforce that oil has to be traded in exchange for US dollars. The United States is quickly losing that reserve currency status because there's nothing backing up the currency anymore. It used to be the currency was backed by gold, and then after that it was by oil with the support of Saudi Arabia, and now it's really backed by essentially nothing. It's still going to keep at least some of its reserve status for a while because businesses and nation states sometimes have agreements for a while stating that we're doing trade in US dollars, and it could be years or decades that those agreements are lasting. And so they could be keeping those currencies in order to pay for those agreements that last for years or decades. And then in terms of weak leadership, I mean, The leadership in America is horrifically weak. They're all over 80 baby boomers. There's not a real younger generation of leaders. The older leaders are the ones who made mistakes decades ago. People like current President Joe Biden really pushed Russia into the corner of China and combined a natural resources powerhouse with a manufacturing powerhouse, which is a disaster and was something that the United States used to try to stop. But now our leadership is just so weak that they're pushing for the destruction of America, either depending on who you talk to, either intentionally or unintentionally. So really, we are somewhere here between, I would say, 15 and 17 in Western society, and increasing signs are pointing to 18 being the case. Just some other things to look at. We see here how America is doing in terms of all of these various factors. And you can see that most of these are on the decline, though military has increased in terms of just the amount of our military, some of our military technology. That's really the last thing propping up. I should say that I said that we went from gold propping up our currency as a reserve currency to oil, but you could also say that the United States military, while it's being funded by the United States having the global reserve and trade currency, it is in turn also something propping up the United States dollar as the global reserve and trade currency as well. So that has to be stabilized to a certain extent. And then here we see rough estimates of the relative standing of great empires in modern times. And you can clearly see on this graph, the blue line is the United States, and they've been sharply declining. I want to say that's probably around when we got off the gold standard. That looks like about the 1970s that the United States really started to decline. Because at that point, it was just paper money that wasn't really backed by much, aside from petrodollar to a certain extent and military power. And you see China has been on a clear upward trend since Deng Xiaoping in particular started to implement state capitalism, and it's been increasing more and more under leaders like Hu Jintao, and then current leader Xi Jinping, who's done an excellent job in the country. And so that is the end of our final segment, and I'll just summarize it for everyone. The United States is declining for a lot of reasons, both similar to prior declining empires and also unique to its own situation. Whether you are pro or anti-American, it is clear to see that the United States is declining. I do think it is possible to disagree about how far along the decline is. I would say we are between 15 and 17 on that 18 points of the progression of empires curve discussed by Ray Dalio. While we don't have revolutions and civil wars yet, a growing portion of the population is considering violence as a legitimate tactic. I personally do not endorse violence, but I understand it historically occurs at the end of declining empires.